Alrighty, welcome back. We are continuing with the advanced EMT. Of course, we're using the Pearson's Advanced EMT Clinical Reasoning Approach, the second edition, the updated version. Chapter 4, Ethical and Medical Legal Considerations in the Advanced EMT Practice. All right, so basically we're just reviewing the information that you learned in your EMT class. So there's not going to be a whole lot of new stuff, but it'll help refresh you, right? So, as an EMS provider, you have a legal and ethical aspect to every call. In order to be protected, or you have to understand these laws and how they apply to your job. You have to understand what your medical ethics are. They ask what ethics are. In Chapter 1, we've seen the EMT oath and the EMT code of conduct that will explain kind of your ethics, but we're going to go over your ethics or your ethical principles. Uh, Benefices is doing good. That's what that means. Non maleficus, do no harm. You're going to be have justice, concern for the well being of others, respect for others. You're going to have advocacy for others, patients' rights to self determination. That means they have the right to make up their own mind if they want care or not. You got to be objective or objectivity, which means objectivity is remaining non-judgmental, right? You don't want to be judging your patient. Avoid conflicts of interest, full disclosure, due diligence or duty of care, confidentiality, and adhere to all personal responsibilities. Right? You should strive to do good, avoid harm, and respect others. Not only as an advanced EMT, but as a person in general. We're going to follow the golden rule, which is do upon others as you'd want done upon yourself. Branches of government in general all areas, right? Laws are created and upheld by the three different branches, right? We have the legislative, the executive, and judicial. I'm not going to go over all these. This is the Constitution. Everybody knows the Constitution, how laws are made, and how it works. There are three different aspects of laws that will affect the advanced EMT and how we practice. Administrative laws. These are the laws that are determined how you get licensed and how you continue your license, right? Your continuing education, your requirements for training, all this. That's the administrative law. Civil law, right? This is legal issues in which one person is liable for damages to another. That's civil law. And of course, criminal law is when you commit a crime, you can be held in a criminal law. And even for us, that comes true. We just talked about that. Authorization to practice, right? Your license is granted by the government or the state. In Illinois, it's the IDPH grants you a state license. In order to get the state license, you have to take a national register test, so you'll be nationally registered as well. And eligibility for license based on your certificate and registration. So you have to prove that you've taken the appropriate training, that you have the knowledge base by passing tests, and then you get a license. EMS personnel will be licensed by their EMS system medical director to practice. So not only does the state of Illinois give you a license, you have to have permission from the medical director in the region that you're coming from. So a lot of places, and speaking in Illinois, I can't speak outside Illinois, but for Illinois, if you move from one region to another to work, most of the time you have to take a protocol test to be granted permission to work in that region, and you have to have a letter of good standing from your old medical director. So you can't just bounce around from region to region if you're not a very good provider. You get in trouble all the time. Whatever, you have to have a letter of good standing from that old medical director. So what's your scope of practice? This is what you're able to do at your level, right? It's legally defined as what the healthcare provider is permitted to do in the course of his duties. Now, remember, there's a difference between scope of practice and standard of care. Scope of practice is what you can do. Standard of care is what you should do. and they base that upon a similar licensed personnel in the field. What they would do is that's the standard of care. Medical direction. Each state has a state and EMS medical director, right? So we have a director over the IDPH, and in each region has a medical director, which is a licensed physician. Uh, what are they responsible for? They do a lot of the QA, QI, or the quality assurance, quality improvement. They'll make the protocols, right? They'll write the protocols. They'll change the protocols and adapt them when needed. They'll set the continuing education limits for that region, like what you're required to have, the minimum requirements. And they're also in charge of any overseeing any issues, inappropriate medical conduct or whatever, any EMS issues. Their oversight. Um, we're going to go into consent and refusal, right? All patients require some form of consent, and you have to obtain an informed consent for a competent patient. This is what they call express consent or informed. If you literally ask them if you can help them and they say yes, that's informed. An express consent would be they nod their head, or you ask if you do a blood pressure and they hold their arm out. Stuff like that is all express consent. And a competent adult patient has the right to refuse all or any part of their care, which means they could completely refuse anything, right? No vitals, nothing. They don't want to talk to you. They sign a refusal, done, right? Or maybe they want to go to the hospital, but they don't want an IV, so they can refuse the IV. We've seen similar situations where it was a traumatic incident or injury, but they didn't want to be put on a long spine board or immobilized. They have the right to refuse that. And remember, the competency is actually determined in the court of law. Um, Capacity is a concept that often applies, which means the patient has the ability to understand the outcome of their decision. That's what capacity means. So to minimize liability concerning consent, you allow follow your protocols and procedures. Law enforcement if necessary. Call your medical directions if you have any questions. Act in the best patient interest and document all relative information. All right. Decision making capacity. Right. There are lots of things that impact one's ability to make the right decision or make decisions. Like, for example, there could be diabetic or diabetes can make you altered. Anything can make you altered could impact that, right? Maybe they're having a stroke. Maybe they're hypoxic. Maybe they're under the influence of some alcohol or drugs. Um, Maybe they don't have the actual capacity to make decisions, like they have dementia or Alzheimer's. All this stuff can impact your decision making. Um, and if they have the lack of that decision making capacity, you're going to document it on your PCR. You're going to really document it, and you're going to document what you're seeing, right? Patients unable to answer questions when asked where they're at, they keep saying yeah, or you know, who's the president? The patient keeps telling me that it's Andrew Jackson or stuff like that. You document it well on your report. Uh, Sometimes when we're talking about the patient's competent, it's actually we're talking about his capacity. This is a sample of a PCR or refusal form. You need to know the difference between express consent and informed consent. Um, they're We talked about the expressed is when they give you like a nod, hold their arm out, whatever. Informed is when they actually tell you yes. What should you do if a patient refuses to consent to treatment? Of course, you're going to try to persuade him, if necessary, to go to the hospital. But after, even contact medical control and involve law enforcement if need be. But after all efforts have been used, you're going to make sure that they sign a refusal, explain it to them what it is, the consequences of not going to the hospital, all that stuff. And implied consent. What is implied consent, right? Implied consent is we would treat a patient under incapacity, saying that if they were in normal capacity, that they would want to be treated. So an unresponsive patient, cardiac arrest patient, a severely mentally altered or patient, uh, all these people that if they were in sound mind, would they want treatment? That's what implied consent is. A minor consent. Remember, a patient that's under 18 cannot legally consent or refuse, except for a few exceptions. Um, you have to get a parent or guardian to give permission, and you're going to treat under the implied consent if no parent or guardian can be reached. Remember, I had mentioned a few exceptions like emancipated minor, if they went and legally got emancipated, if they're in the military. Um, Pregnant female minors have a right to refuse because they're emancipated. So there are a few exceptions to that rule. But when in doubt, contact medical control or law enforcement if you have to. Legal consequences of obtaining a proper consent, right, for treatment could lead to claims of abandonment. What's abandonment? That's when you release care to a lower level care provider. Then you're considered abandoned, or you leave your patient. Assault and battery. Assault is when a patient is in fear, right? And battery is actually when you physically harm them. And false imprisonment. You can be charged with false imprisonment if you take someone against their will that is competent. You can get charged with false imprisonment. And by the way, all these are criminal acts, so you could be held in criminal law. Let's talk about DNRs, resuscitation decisions, right? Resuscitation performed with patient cardiac arrest, of course, when it's not appropriate, when there's obvious death, when the patient has an advance directive, um, or when a patient has a directive you are legally allowed to recognize according to your protocols. We'll talk about them here in a minute. Advanced directives are either the POSTs or the DNRs. In our state, it's DNR or do not resuscitate orders. What is a proxy, or what is a healthcare proxy or durable power of attorney? These are legal documents that grants another person the right to make your decisions if you're incapacitated for some reason. That's what these are. Here's a DNR. Remember DNR, at least in the state of Illinois, they have to be signed by the patient, they have to be signed by the physician, and they're only good for a year. So in Illinois, they're good for a year. Some states 6 months. Some states it's more than that. You just have to know what your state DNR is. Do not resuscitate or DNR order. Like I said, it has to be signed. This is you have to read your order too because there's. Let's go back to that. There's one that says do not resuscitate. That means you don't make no efforts. And then the section B is modified. Maybe you can give them oxygen. You can do intubation. There's just different sections. They have to be marked what you can do and what you can't do, right? So if they're marked, they want you to do it. We talked about that. What are signs of death? Absence of pulse and breathing, unresponsive to all stimuli, no eye movement or pupil response, the absence of reflexes, dependent lividity, and rigor mortis are all signs of death. Now you're going to withhold termination and not even begin resuscitation efforts if there's signs of incompatible with life, like decapitation, transection of the body, decomposition, charring, rigor mortis, or liver mortis. If any of these signs are there, we're not even going to start efforts. If you, a lot of protocol state you have to call medical control, even if certain signs are there. So you have to consult with medical control. You're going to follow your protocols. You may have to notify a coroner or medical examiner's office. In our area, that's exactly what happens. A lot of times they're already notified if it's suspected, but we'll get hold of dispatch to tell them, to involve coroner. And if it's a suspicious death, you may have to get law enforcement involved. This doesn't happen very often because law enforcement is usually already there. Um, on a lot of these calls, even natural deaths, law enforcement will show up. Where do we go from here? Matter of civil law. When a patient or another person suffers damage because of something you did or your action, that party has a right to sue, and he can be sued for money to compensate for the damage, right? And then they become the plaintiff, or the person that's suing is the plaintiff, and you, the provider, is the defendant. In order to be prosecuted for neglect or sued for neglect in civil law, it has to constitute four different issues, right? You have to have a duty to act. We all know what duty to act is. You know, you're paid, you have a duty to respond to calls, you're on shift. That's all duty to act. There's a breach in that duty to act, which means you refused to go to a call or you delayed the call. This is all breach of duty. Actual damage occurred, so something happened or occurred because of something you did, and the proximate cause means that damage is because of something you did directly, not because of some underlying condition the patient has. The breach of duty, there's three different categories. There's malfeasance, misfeasance, and nonfeasance. We'll go into that in the next slide here. Malfeasance is perform an improper act. That's when you do a skill that's not within your scope. Um, or perform a skill on a patient that don't need it. For example, you're going to insert an advanced airway with a gag reflex causing vomiting, aspiration, and stomach contents, which in turn cause aspirated pneumonia. The patient could die from that. Misfeasance is improper performance of a legitimate act. Okay. So, for example, a patient needs an IV and dextrose, but fails to recognize the IV is infiltrated. And then you give them the dextrose, especially D50, which is very necrotic or to tissue, so it kills the tissue and it causes damage, right? So that's misfeasance. Non-feasance is failure to perform an act that should have been performed, right? Like the patient needed to be defibrillated and you didn't do it, or the patient needed an airway and you didn't do it. That's a non-feasance. Civil cases, right? In the civil cases, you as a defendant has to prove beyond reasonable doubt that what you did was wrong. The burden of proof is usually on the plaintiff. However, if the plaintiff invokes the doctrine of res imposa lacer, then that shifts to you. I don't know exactly all that is involved in that. That's a lawyer thing, but I know they just can't um, invoke this for no reason. They have to have good reasoning for this. Um, so, what are some of the different types of harm that can be compensated, right? Physical harm, you physically harm a patient. Psychological harm. So, what's psychological harm? You know, you threaten your patient or they're psychologically damaged because of you. And financial harm. Proximal cause, we talked about earlier, this is what you did is directly caused damage, or the damage was because of what you did. We talked about scope of practice, standard of care. Other civil claims could breach confidentiality, which is your HIPAA, or defamation of character, which is spreading lies or false information about a person and results in injury in their character. This can be in two forms: slander, which is verbal, or libel, which is written, right? So these are the two different forms of defamation. High risk situations, medication errors, dropping or improper handling of the patient. If you get in a wreck with a patient on board, or if you have to use physical restraints and uh, you only use the amount of force needed, but you used too much and they got hurt because they were not being the best of patients and you were angry. This is all high risk situations. The HIPAA laws, the EMTALA and COBRA, EMTELA is the right to receive emergency medical treatment or care or transportation, regardless on your ability to pay. And COBRA is the Consolidated Omnibus Budget Recognition Act, which is also known as the Anti-Dumping Act. You can't not treat a patient because they can't pay or whatever, so you send them to a lower level of hospital or because of that. That's the COBRA. HIPAA, sometimes it's a provision regarding personal health information. Sometimes we can release this information if we have a written consent of a patient, for example, especially if they want a third party to have it, like their attorney or something like that, they can give you consent in writing to release their medical records. Um, Medical providers that need it. So, like when we do the inbound report or handoff report, those we can talk about the patient's medical information or health information. If you're court ordered, if for billing purposes we can release information, and you as an independent advanced EMT are not going to be releasing information for billing or the court order. That's going to be in your management of your company. And remember that a patient has a right to inspect their medical record at any time, and they can also request an amendment to that. So, how are you going to protect yourself from legal obligations or legal protection? You understand and adhere to the standard of care, right? Um, Exercise due diligence in all activities, right? Act in good faith and professionalism in both appearance and in your action. These will all help against legal action. Good Samaritan laws. Do they apply to you as a provider? Yes and no. If you have a duty to act and you're on duty, the Good Samaritan laws don't pertain to you. However, if you're off duty and you come up on a car wreck and you administer aid, or the woman in front of you in the grocery line collapses and you administer aid if you're off duty, yes, the Good Samaritan laws do apply to you just because you hold a licensure. Government immunity, which means that the government can't be sued. Statute of limitations mean there's a time limit for people to actually bring legal actions against you. Thorough and accurate documentation will also help protect you from any of this. And it may happen, right? We have a chance to go to court on any call, but I will tell you the percentage of people that are found guilty or is pretty low, especially if you have good, thorough, and accurate documentation. Crime scene, right? You can protect yourself because a crime scene may be an unsafe scene. So you have to, that situational awareness we talked about last chapter. Uh, you have to care for your patient regardless if it's a crime scene or not. But we want to take some precaution if we can, right? We don't want to destroy any evidence, which means like if it's a gunshot wound, we got to remove the clothes or cut around that, leave the gunshot or the hole intact. Um, disturb as little as possible. So if you do have to move something on a crime scene, it's a good idea to note it and let the law enforcement know, hey, I moved this chair from here to here, right? You're going to try to take the same path in and out, right? That's less evidence disruption, less of your like DNA and all this stuff is in there is better. And you're going to use the minimal number of providers that needed. You're not going to send in the entire company. It's going to be the minimal number of people that need to be in there. We talked about avoiding cutting through gunshot or stab wound. If the patient is dead, we're not going to enter it. Let them know if you moved anything, like I said, and document any observations and actions. Other legal issues, you're going to be aware of laws in your area. They change from location to location. Organ donation, some states, some areas require that the EMS personnel ask about organ donation in a cardiac arrest situation. Remember that you should know your mandatory reporting laws. We are mandated reporters. Child abuse, spousal abuse, any gun or knife wound violence, elderly abuse, neglect were reported, mandated reporters, right? And remember, all patients are entitled to the same standard of care, no matter their race, their color, their sex, their sexual identity, all that. Every patient's entitled to the same care. Now, borrowed servant doctrine. This is something that if you provide directions or supervision to someone that's licensed lower than you, for example, you're working with an EMT and you provide directions or supervision to that EMT, and that person fails to uphold the standard of care, you may be held responsible. All right, chapter summary. AMTs operate within a legal and ethical structure, authorized to practice, awareness of issues of patient consent, adhere to standard care, maintaining patient confidentiality, and exercising diligence in all actions and decision making. Be aware of your legal and ethical obligations. Apply judgment to avoid claims of assault, battery, false imprisonment, or abandonment. Protect yourself from liability and document the facts. To establish negligence, remember there has to be four things. You have to have a duty to act. You have to breach that duty. Patient had to have harm, and then you have to have that proximal cause or your actions or omissions uh, was direct harm to that patient. All righty, that'll do it for chapter 4. We will catch you on chapter 5.